New Year's Eve is meant to close one chapter and quietly open another. It is a night people associate with reflection and hope, a final pause before the calendar turns, a moment when families gather, when friends embrace, when strangers count down together believing that whatever comes next might be better than what came before. But in a small town in North Carolina, that same night was almost remembered for something else entirely. Not fireworks, not cheers, not the glow of a new beginning, but blood. As the hours ticked closer to midnight, nothing on the surface suggested danger. Streets were calm. Businesses stayed open a little later than usual. Grocery stores buzzed with last-minute shoppers picking up drinks, snacks, ingredients for meals that would be shared in living rooms and kitchens. Fast food restaurants were busy, serving customers who wanted something quick before the celebrations began. It was ordinary, comfortably ordinary, and that was the problem. Because while the town prepared for celebration, a plan was already in motion. A plan that did not involve noise or spectacle. A plan that relied on surprise, proximity, and timing. A plan designed to unfold quietly, up close, and without mercy. What makes this story unsettling is not just what was planned, but how close it came to happening. This was not a threat discovered years in advance. It was not a vague warning buried in intelligence files. It was immediate, days away, hours away, a countdown running parallel to the one everyone else was watching. And if you're watching this channel for the first time, this is where Real Crime Saga comes in. Here, we don't just tell you what happened. We walk you through how it unfolded. We examine the decisions, the warning signs, the moments where everything could have gone wrong, and sometimes barely didn't. So if you value in-depth true crime storytelling, stories that don't rush, stories that respect the gravity of real lives and real consequences, take a moment to subscribe to Real Crime Saga. This channel exists for stories like this, the ones that don't always make headlines because the worst part never happened. Now back to that night. As the town settled into the familiar rhythm of New Year's Eve, law enforcement agencies elsewhere were watching something very different. They were not focused on celebrations. They were focused on prevention, on a single individual, on a set of messages, plans, and preparations that suggested that midnight was not going to mark a new beginning, but an ending. What the public didn't know was that this wasn't about chaos in a crowd or an explosive moment meant to shock the world. This was something colder, something quieter, a form of violence that doesn't rely on distance, but on closeness. On choosing places where people feel safe enough to let their guard down. The night almost became a crime scene. A holiday almost turned into a memorial. And the reason it didn't starts with understanding where this threat came from and who was behind it. That story begins not with a town, but with a single mind quietly moving toward a point of no return. Mint Hill, North Carolina, a town where days tend to follow familiar patterns. Morning traffic that slows near intersections everyone already knows. Grocery stores where regulars recognize the cashiers. Drive-through windows that serve the same orders to the same faces week after week. It is the kind of place where routine creates a sense of safety, not because nothing bad has ever happened, but because life feels predictable. On New Year's Eve, that predictability was on full display. Parking lots filled and emptied at a steady pace. Shopping carts rattled across asphalt. Employees checked the time, counting down the hours left in their shifts, already thinking about where they would be when midnight arrived. Some planned to celebrate. Others planned to rest. A few just wanted the day to be over. On the surface, nothing was wrong. Families were preparing for celebration. People stood in grocery aisles debating brands and prices, distracted by small decisions that felt important in the moment. Parents reminded children to stay close. Couples discussed dinner plans. Strangers exchanged polite nods as they passed each other, unaware of how briefly their paths might cross. Inside fast food restaurants, the atmosphere was rushed but ordinary. Orders were called out. Fryers hummed. Workers moved on autopilot, doing what they had done dozens of times before, trusting that the familiarity of the space meant safety. No alarms sounded. No warnings were issued. No one looked twice. And that is what made these places ideal targets. because they were not chosen at random. They were chosen precisely because they felt harmless, because people let their guard down there, because they represented everyday life, unremarkable, accessible, and full of people who never imagined they would become part of a story like this. What no one in Mint Hill knew was that, somewhere not far away, someone had already studied these routines. He understood the flow of people. He knew which places would be crowded without being heavily protected. He knew that New Year's Eve created just enough distraction to hide something far more sinister in plain sight. This was not about spectacle. It was about proximity, about blending in long enough to strike. The town itself had done nothing wrong. It had simply existed as it always had. Open, familiar, trusting. And in that trust, it became vulnerable. The most chilling part is not that Mint Hill was targeted. It's that it could have been almost anywhere. A grocery store, a drive-thru, a place people stop without thinking twice. And while residents moved through their evening, unaware of the danger circling closer, the person behind the plan was not thinking about celebrations. He wasn't thinking about family or fireworks or the turn of the year. He was thinking about timing, about access, about how ordinary life could be weaponized. The town was not asleep. It was simply unaware. And as Mint Hill prepared to welcome a new year, the focus now shifts away from the streets and storefronts and toward the individual who believed this night would give him purpose, meaning, and recognition. To understand how close this town came to tragedy, we have to step inside the mind that saw these familiar places not as community, but as opportunity. The danger did not come from abroad. It did not arrive hidden in luggage or smuggled across borders. It did not wear a uniform or speak with a foreign accent. It came from an 18-year-old living at home, quiet, young, and largely invisible. He did not stand out in the way people expect threats to. There were no dramatic warning signs that announced his intentions to the outside world. No public outbursts. No criminal history that immediately raised alarms. To neighbors, to passersby, he was just another teenager in the background of a suburban town. But beneath that surface, something far more dangerous was taking shape. Investigators say he had fallen under the influence of ISIS, not through battlefields, not through training camps, not through secret meetings in dark rooms, but through screens, through messages read alone, through videos watched repeatedly, through ideology consumed in silence. Radicalization did not arrive all at once. It did not knock. It did not demand attention. It seeped in slowly, almost invisibly, wrapping itself around a young mind still forming its sense of identity and purpose. At first, it may have looked like curiosity, then agreement, then belief, and eventually, something far more dangerous, commitment. What makes this stage so unsettling is how ordinary it is. There was no dramatic transformation visible to the outside world. No moment where someone could clearly say, this is when it began. Instead, the process unfolded quietly, in private moments, behind closed doors, away from scrutiny. Radicalization rarely announces itself. It whispers. It reassures. It convinces. It offers meaning where there is confusion. Certainty where there is doubt. Power where there is frustration. For someone young, searching for identity, it can feel like clarity. And once it takes hold, it is not easily let go. Investigators later determined that this was not passive consumption. This was engagement, interaction, a willingness to internalize extremist beliefs and translate them into action. The ideology did not remain theoretical. It became personal. Violence, in his mind, was no longer abstract. It was justified, necessary, even righteous. And this is where the danger truly began. Because while ideology can exist without action, planning cannot. Once thoughts turn into preparation, the line between belief and violence disappears entirely. The most chilling part is not just what he believed, but how normal everything around him still looked. He lived at home. He followed routines. He existed in the same world as everyone else in Mint Hill, unnoticed. No one walking past him would have guessed what was forming beneath the surface. No one standing beside him in line would have known they were near someone quietly preparing for mass harm. Radicalization did not explode into existence. It crept in slowly, it settled in, and it stayed. And as it stayed, it began to look for an outlet. To understand how this ideology moved from belief to preparation, we have to look back to the first warning signs that surfaced years earlier, signs that suggested this was not a sudden shift, but a return to something that had never fully disappeared. That history would later prove crucial in understanding just how close this plan came to being carried out. Long before New Year's Eve entered the picture, there were warning signs. They did not appear as sirens or emergency calls. They were quieter than that, subtle enough to be questioned, easy enough to explain away. But in hindsight, they mattered. Years earlier, while he was still a minor, the young man at the center of this case allegedly reached out to individuals he believed were connected to ISIS overseas. These were not casual exchanges. They reflected curiosity, admiration, and a desire to connect with something far beyond his immediate world. At the time, this behavior raised serious concern. But the response was not handcuffs or prison bars. It was family. Those closest to him noticed something was wrong. Whether it was changes in behavior, fixation on certain ideas, or alarming online activity, the signs were strong enough to prompt intervention. Mental health professionals became involved. Conversations were had. Support structures were put in place. The situation was treated as a crisis, but not yet a crime. This distinction matters, because in many cases involving young people, especially minors, the goal is prevention rather than punishment. The belief is that early intervention can redirect a person before harmful ideas fully take root. That care, guidance, and treatment might succeed where force cannot. For a time, it appeared to work. The communication stopped. The immediate threat seemed to fade. Life resumed its familiar shape. To those watching closely, it looked like the problem had been addressed, contained, resolved. The crisis passed, or so it seemed. What no one could be certain of was whether the ideology itself had been dismantled or simply buried. Extremist belief systems are not like passing phases. They do not always disappear when attention shifts elsewhere. Sometimes they lie dormant, waiting for the right conditions to resurface, waiting for frustration, isolation, or perceived purpose to reopen the door. And years later, that door quietly creaked open again. The troubling reality is that intervention does not always equal eradication. Mental health support can stabilize behavior, but belief is harder to undo. And when that belief remains unchallenged internally, it can return stronger, more calculated, and far more dangerous. This case illustrates one of the most difficult challenges faced by families, professionals, and authorities alike. How to measure success when nothing happens. How to know whether silence means healing or concealment. Because the absence of violence does not always mean the absence of intent. As time passed, the young man aged out of the systems designed to protect and redirect minors. He entered adulthood carrying unresolved ideas that had once alarmed those around him. Ideas that no longer triggered immediate concern because they were no longer visible. And then quietly, deliberately, those ideas began to surface again. Not as cries for help, not as warning signs to those nearby, but as renewed commitment expressed online away from the people who once intervened. By the time these beliefs re-emerged publicly, they were no longer tentative. They were focused, and they were looking for action. To understand how the situation escalated from old warning signs to an imminent threat, we now have to examine the moment everything changed, the point at which belief turned into intent and the plan began to take shape once more. That moment arrived in December. By December, the beliefs had resurfaced, not tentatively, not confused, but sharpened by time and silence. This time, there was no uncertainty about what he stood for. Whatever hesitation may have existed years earlier was gone. The ideas he once explored now appeared settled, internalized, and fully embraced. The ideology had not weakened with age. It had matured, and it came back with purpose. Online, the tone shifted. Messages that once hinted at admiration or curiosity became explicit. Language hardened. Praise for extremist violence was no longer implied. It was stated. Support for terror groups was no longer abstract. It was affirmed. Support had turned into intent. This stage is often the most dangerous because it marks a psychological crossing point. The moment when belief alone is no longer enough. When validation, action, and recognition begin to matter more than consequences. He wasn't just consuming propaganda anymore. He was participating, engaging, reaching outward, seeking connection with what he believed was a larger cause. And that's when the net quietly tightened around him. Because while he believed he was speaking to like-minded individuals, he wasn't. What the suspect didn't know was this. The people listening were already watching. Behind the screen, responses were measured. Questions were asked carefully. Conversations were allowed to unfold naturally. No pressure, no rush, just enough encouragement to let intent reveal itself. This is how law enforcement often operates in cases like this. Not by forcing action, but by allowing someone to show how far they are willing to go. And he showed it. He spoke about violence not as a hypothetical, but as something imminent. He discussed methods, locations, timing. He framed his ideas as obligations rather than fantasies, as if the act itself was inevitable. This was no longer radical thought drifting in isolation. This was planning taking shape in real time. What made this phase particularly alarming was how composed it appeared. There was no chaos in his words, no emotional outbursts. Everything sounded deliberate, calculated, almost rehearsed. That calmness is often misunderstood. It does not mean stability. It means resolve. As the conversations continued, investigators were able to observe not just what he believed, but how he thought, how he justified harm, how he reduced potential victims to symbols rather than people, how he spoke of violence as something clean, purposeful, and deserved. This is where ideology becomes operational. And as December progressed, the urgency grew. Dates were referenced, scenarios discussed. The clock, once abstract, now had a deadline. New Year's Eve, a night of distraction, a night of crowds, a night when attention would be elsewhere. From the outside, everything still looked normal. He lived his life. He followed routines. He blended seamlessly into the background of a town preparing to celebrate. But in private, the return was complete. The beliefs were no longer dormant. They were active, and they were moving toward action. What he didn't realize was that every word, every message, every detail he shared was being carefully documented. Not as opinion, but as evidence. Evidence that would soon determine whether this was a case of dangerous speech or an imminent act of mass violence. As the conversations unfolded and the plan began to solidify, law enforcement faced a familiar and urgent question. How long do you watch? Before watching becomes waiting too long? The answer would come soon, because the next phase of this story is where thought became preparation, and preparation became a countdown that could no longer be ignored. The plan was simple, and that's what made it dangerous. There were no explosives to assemble, no firearms to acquire, no complicated logistics that could fall apart under pressure. And there was no escape plan. What he envisioned did not rely on distance or spectacle. It relied on closeness, on blending in long enough to strike, on the brutal efficiency of everyday objects turned into weapons. Just knives, hammers, crowded places. In his mind, simplicity was strength. Investigators would later describe the plan as disturbingly direct. The absence of complexity was not a flaw, it was intentional. Simple plans are harder to detect, harder to interrupt. They require fewer resources and less outside involvement. They can be carried out by one person quietly, without warning. And they can begin anywhere. Grocery stores, fast food restaurants, places chosen not for symbolism, but for access. These were locations where people stand close to one another without suspicion, where no one expects violence, where attention is scattered between shopping lists, ringing phones, orders being called out. Places where guards are down because routine has taught people they are safe. The plan did not involve shouting slogans or making demands. There was no manifesto meant for the public eye. There was only the act itself, sudden, intimate, and irreversible. Close enough to hear breathing. Close enough to see faces. That detail matters, because it reveals the nature of what he was preparing to do. This was not abstract harm inflicted from afar. It was violence that required proximity. Violence that required looking at another human being and choosing not to stop. Handwritten notes later recovered would reveal just how much thought had gone into this. Not chaotic scribbles, not vague ideas, but structure plans, timelines, target considerations, reflections on how the attack would unfold. The notes were titled with chilling clarity, tied directly to New Year's Eve. This was not impulse. It was anticipation. He thought about movement through spaces, about how to enter unnoticed, about how quickly panic would spread once the first person was attacked, about how confusion would slow response times, about how a lack of immediate resistance could allow him to keep going. The absence of an escape plan speaks volumes. It suggests that survival was not the objective. Completion was. This is often one of the most alarming indicators in cases like this. When someone plans an attack without considering how to get away, it signals a mindset that has moved beyond fear of consequences. The act itself becomes the endpoint, and all of this was unfolding while the town continued its countdown to midnight, while families made plans, while employees finished shifts, while strangers stood side by side, unaware of how narrowly they were being studied. The plan was no longer theoretical. It was written down, visualized, prepared for. By this point, law enforcement was no longer dealing with dangerous speech or extremist belief alone. They were confronting a concrete, time-bound plan for mass violence. And with New Year's Eve approaching fast, there was no room left for hesitation. Watching was no longer enough. The question was no longer if this could happen, but when. And with every passing hour, that answer was getting closer to midnight. As the calendar crept toward December 31st, the threat became immediate. What had once been monitored as ideology, as belief, as dangerous rhetoric, crossed a line that could not be uncrossed. This was no longer about what someone thought or said behind screen. It was about what had already been gathered, written, and set aside for use. This was preparation, and preparation has weight. By this stage, law enforcement understood something critical. The window for prevention was closing. The conversations were no longer exploratory. The notes were no longer drafts. The weapons were no longer hypothetical. Everything necessary for the attack existed, and the only missing element was time. Time that was slipping away. Each day that passed brought the suspect closer to the moment he had chosen. New Year's Eve was no longer symbolic. It was scheduled. A fixed point on the calendar that dictated urgency and forced decisions. This is the most difficult phase in cases like this. Intervene too early, and the case risks collapsing under the argument of intent without action. Wait too long, and prevention becomes reaction, measured in casualties instead of evidence. There is no margin for error here. Investigators were not just tracking a person. They were tracking momentum, watching for signs of acceleration, listening for cues that indicated readiness, assessing whether hesitation still existed or whether resolve had hardened beyond doubt. What they heard offered little comfort. The suspect spoke with clarity. He referred to the date without ambiguity. He framed the attack as something that would happen, not something he was still considering. The language of possibility had been replaced with certainty. This is when time becomes the enemy. Because while law enforcement weighed legal thresholds and operational risks, the world outside continued as normal. The town moved closer to celebration. Schedules filled, crowds grew, and the suspect continued preparing quietly, unnoticed by anyone around him. There's a unique pressure that comes with knowing what might happen next, and knowing that the people who could be harmed have no idea they are in danger. They are not hiding. They are not running. They are going about their lives, trusting that the night will pass like any other holiday. This is where prevention feels heavy, because stopping a crime that hasn't happened requires certainty, not hope. It requires confidence that intervention is justified, necessary, and urgent. And it requires acting before there is public proof. As December 31st drew closer, that certainty arrived. Investigators could no longer justify waiting. The convergence of planning, materials, and timing removed any remaining doubt. The risk was no longer abstract. It was immediate, and when threats become immediate, silence is no longer an option. Every hour mattered. Every decision carried consequence. The countdown wasn't just happening on clocks across the town. It was happening inside briefing rooms, inside operational plans, inside the narrow window between prevention and catastrophe. The next step would determine everything, because once the date arrived, there would be no second chance. The only remaining question was not whether to act, but how quickly they could move. And the answer came before midnight. Days before New Year's Eve, the moment law enforcement had been moving toward finally arrived. There was no public announcement, no flashing lights, no sense of urgency visible to the outside world. The Federal Bureau of Investigation moved quietly, deliberately, the way agencies do when timing matters more than visibility. By this point, the case was no longer theoretical. It was no longer about monitoring beliefs or assessing online rhetoric. Investigators were now dealing with something tangible, something physical, something that could not be ignored. A search warrant was approved, and with that, the line between watching and acting disappeared. The location was unremarkable. A home, familiar, ordinary, the kind of place that blends into its surroundings, offering no hint of what it contains. There were no barricades, no warning signs, just a front door that opened into a private space where a public threat had been quietly taking shape. Inside, agents moved with purpose. They weren't searching blindly. They knew what they were looking for. They knew where to look. A bedroom, not a bunker, not a warehouse. A bedroom, the kind of room associated with rest, privacy, and youth. A space meant for safety, now repurposed as a staging ground for violence. And then the bed. Beneath it, the final pieces came into view. Knives, not decorative, not accidental, chosen. Hammers, heavy, close range, personal, tactical gear. Items that serve no everyday purpose in a teenager's life, but make sense when viewed through the lens of preparation. And then the written plans. This was the confirmation investigators needed, because written plans remove doubt. They demonstrate intent in a way words spoken aloud sometimes cannot. They show forethought, commitment, a willingness to move beyond fantasy into execution. They capture the mind of someone preparing not just for violence, but for a specific moment in time. New Year's Eve. The documents were not rambling. They were structured, focused, anchored to a date. They outlined how the attack would unfold, where it would happen, and how it would be carried out. This was not the product of panic or impulse. It was anticipation. Standing in that room, the reality of how close this had come became impossible to ignore. Everything necessary for the attack was present. The weapons, the gear, the plan, everything needed, except the moment. And that moment was approaching fast. This is the point where prevention becomes unmistakably justified, where intervention is no longer a judgment call, but an obligation, where waiting becomes more dangerous than acting. What makes this stage haunting is not just what was found, but what it represents. The transformation of an ordinary private space into the final stop before mass harm. The way something meant for rest became a holding place for violence waiting to be unleashed. Had law enforcement waited even a little longer, that bed would have been empty. The items beneath it would have been in motion. The plans would have moved from paper into reality. But they didn't, because intervention happened here. Quietly, decisively, in time. With the search complete and the evidence secured, there was only one step left. One final move that would ensure the plan never reached its intended audience. The arrest. And it would come before the world welcomed a new year. On New Year's Eve, before crowds gathered and before midnight arrived, the final step was taken. There was no dramatic buildup visible to the public. No sirens cutting through the air. No emergency broadcasts interrupting celebrations. For everyone else, the day unfolded like any other holiday. Slow in some places, busy in others, filled with anticipation for what the night would bring. But for the people tracking this case, the day carried a different weight. By this point, the decision had already been made. The evidence was secured. The risk was undeniable. Allowing the day to continue without intervention was no longer an option. So, agents stepped in. The timing mattered. Waiting until nightfall would have meant waiting too long. The goal was not to respond to violence. It was to prevent it entirely. That meant acting before the suspect could blend into crowds, before routines shifted, before the opportunity to disappear into ordinary life presented itself. There was no chase. He wasn't running. There was no confrontation. He wasn't expecting resistance. This wasn't the kind of arrest seen in films or headlines. It was controlled, measured, quiet, the kind of ending that rarely draws attention because nothing explodes and no one is hurt. Just a door opening and a plan ending. In that moment, a countdown stopped. The weapons would not leave the bedroom. The notes would not guide anyone into public spaces. The places that had been chosen would remain just that, places. For the suspect, this was the moment where belief collided with reality, where intention met consequence, where everything he had been preparing for was abruptly taken out of his control. There were no final statements, no last-minute justifications. The arrest wasn't a stage for ideology. It was the end of a process that had been unfolding quietly for months. What makes this moment significant is not just what happened, but what didn't. No one screamed. No one ran. No one realized how close they had come to being in danger. In the hours that followed, people across Mint Hill continued with their plans. They gathered with friends. They watched the clock. They counted down to midnight, believing the night had passed without incident. And they were right, but only because of what happened behind the scenes. This is the invisible side of prevention, the kind that leaves no scars, no headlines of tragedy, no public memory of chaos, the kind that succeeds precisely because it ends quietly. The suspect would now face the consequences of his actions in courtrooms rather than crime scenes. The case would shift from surveillance to prosecution, for prevention to accountability. And while the world welcomed a new year, unaware of the threat that had been removed, law enforcement closed the final chapter of a story that was never meant to be told, because it was never meant to happen. But the story doesn't end here. Because when a crime is stopped before it occurs, the aftermath is not measured in damage, but in absence, in silence, in the uncomfortable knowledge of how easily this night could have gone another way. That reflection is where this story now leads. The arrest, full narration. On New Year's Eve, before crowds gathered and before midnight arrived, the final step was taken. There was no dramatic build-up visible to the public, no sirens cutting through the air, no emergency broadcasts interrupting celebrations. For everyone else, the day unfolded like any other holiday, slow in some places, busy in others, filled with anticipation for what the night would bring. But for the people tracking this case, the day carried a different weight. By this point, the decision had already been made. The evidence was secured. The risk was undeniable. Allowing the day to continue without intervention was no longer an option. So agents stepped in. The timing mattered. Waiting until nightfall would have meant waiting too long. The goal was not to respond to violence. It was to prevent it entirely. That meant acting before the suspect could blend into crowds, before routines shifted, before the opportunity to disappear into ordinary life presented itself. There was no chase. He wasn't running. There was no confrontation. He wasn't expecting resistance. This wasn't the kind of arrest seen in films or headlines. It was controlled, measured, quiet, the kind of ending that rarely draws attention because nothing explodes and no one is hurt. Just a door opening and a plan ending. In that moment, a countdown stopped. The weapons would not leave the bedroom. The notes would not guide anyone into public spaces. The places that had been chosen would remain just that, places. For the suspect, this was the moment where belief collided with reality, where intention met consequence, where everything he had been preparing for was abruptly taken out of his control. There were no final statements, no last-minute justifications. The arrest wasn't a stage for ideology. It was the end of a process that had been unfolding quietly for months. What What makes this moment significant is not just what happened, but what didn't. No one screamed. No one ran. No one realized how close they had come to being in danger. In the hours that followed, people across Mint Hill continued with their plans. They gathered with friends. They watched the clock. They counted down to midnight, believing the night had passed without incident. And they were right, but only because of what happened behind the scenes. This is the invisible side of prevention, the kind that leaves no scars, no headlines of tragedy, no public memory of chaos, the kind that succeeds precisely because it ends quietly. The suspect would now face the consequences of his actions in courtrooms rather than crime scenes. The case would shift from surveillance to prosecution, from prevention to accountability. And while the world welcomed a new year, unaware of the threat that had been removed, law enforcement closed the final chapter of a story that was never meant to be told, because it was never meant to happen. But the story doesn't end here, because when a crime is stopped before it occurs, the aftermath is not measured in damage, but in absence, in silence, in the uncomfortable knowledge of how easily this night could have gone another way. That reflection is where this story now leads. What didn't happen is the hardest part of this story to explain, and the most important to understand. The public never heard screams. There were no panic phone calls flooding emergency lines. No chaotic footage circulating online. No emergency alerts lighting up phones with warnings to shelter in place. No breaking news banners interrupting broadcasts. No lists of victims scrolling across screens. No vigils held in parking lots that were never meant to become memorials. No names were read on the news. And that was the point, because success in cases like this is invisible. It leaves nothing dramatic behind. No crime scene tape. No forensic timelines. No public grief to mark the moment when everything went wrong. Instead, it leaves silence. Authorities would later state that the arrest likely prevented a mass casualty attack. That phrase carries weight, but it also carries ambiguity. It speaks to harm that was anticipated, modeled, and narrowly avoided. It acknowledges danger without forcing the public to relive it through loss. This was a crime measured not by what occurred, but by what didn't. That absence is difficult to grasp because human attention gravitates toward aftermath. We remember tragedies because they leave scars. We learn names because lives were taken. We react because damage is visible. Prevention offers none of that. It offers a normal night, a quiet holiday, a new year that arrives without incident. And that normalcy can feel deceptive because it hides how fragile it actually was. People in Mint Hill woke up the next morning unaware that the places they had visited, grocery aisles, fast food counters, familiar parking lots, had been studied as potential scenes of violence. They returned to routines without knowing how close those routines came to being shattered. There were no public warnings because there was no public danger by the time midnight arrived. That danger had already been removed, and yet the weight of it lingers. It lingers because this case forces uncomfortable questions. How many threats go unnoticed? How many moments depend on intervention that never becomes visible? How often is safety preserved quietly, without acknowledgement? It also highlights the thin line between ordinary life and irreversible tragedy. The difference in this case was timing. Hours, minutes, decisions made before anyone else realized a decision was necessary. The suspect's plan will never be fully known to the public because it never unfolded. Its consequences exist only on paper, in notes recovered and scenarios prevented. Its victims exist only in the abstract, people who were never aware they had been placed in harm's way. That absence is not an accident. It is the outcome. And while some may question the seriousness of a crime that never happened, law enforcement measures these cases by proximity, not outcome, by intent, preparation, and immediacy, by how close a plan comes to being executed. In this case, it was close, uncomfortably close. And that is why this story matters, because it reminds us that danger does not always announce itself, that safety is sometimes maintained not through visible force, but through quiet action taken before a line is crossed. The lack of screams does not mean there was no threat. The lack of headlines does not mean there was no plan. It means someone stopped it in time. and that's silence. The ordinary, forgettable silence of a night that passed peacefully is the final evidence that the intervention worked. What didn't happen is the story. And understanding that is what allows us to see prevention not as absence, but as success. Terrorism doesn't always come with warnings. It doesn't always arrive with explosions, chaos, or declarations meant to shock the world. Sometimes it arrives quietly. Sometimes it looks ordinary. Sometimes it blends so completely into everyday life that it goes unnoticed until it is almost too late. In this case, it looked like a teenager living at home. It looked like routine. It looked like another New Year's Eve waiting to unfold. And that is what makes stories like this so unsettling. Because the threat did not come from a distant battlefield or a shadowy organization operating in plain sight. It came from within the fabric of ordinary life. From familiar streets. From places people trust. From the assumption that danger is always obvious when it arrives. Sometimes it isn't. Sometimes it waits quietly. It waits in bedrooms, in handwritten notes, in plans built around routines people take for granted. It waits for moments of distraction, for holidays, for nights when attention is elsewhere and vulnerability feels harmless. It waits for a date circled on a calendar that means celebration to most and purpose to one. And sometimes it is stopped just in time. This story did not end with sirens or funerals. It did not end with grief or unanswered questions. It ended with an arrest few people noticed, a plan that never unfolded, and a night that passed as if nothing had ever threatened it. That outcome is easy to overlook, but it matters. It matters because prevention does not leave behind proof in the form of tragedy. It leaves behind normalcy. And normalcy, in a world shaped by violent headlines, can feel forgettable, but should not be, because every ordinary moment that continues uninterrupted is often the result of unseen decisions, quiet vigilance, and actions taken before fear becomes reality. This was a new year that nearly became a nightmare, a town that nearly became a crime scene, a moment that could have been defined by loss, but wasn't. And the silence that followed was not emptiness. It was success. Before we end this story, it's worth remembering this. The absence of violence does not mean the absence of danger. It means someone recognized it early enough, took it seriously enough, and acted decisively enough to stop it. That is the difference between tragedy and relief. If stories like this matter to you, the ones that explore not just what happens, but what almost did, then Real Crime Saga is the place for you. Here, we tell the stories that don't always make headlines, but still shape lives in ways most people never see. Thank you for listening. Thank you for staying until the end. And as you move forward into your own ordinary moments, remember how close this night came to being something else entirely, and how powerful silence can be when it means lives were spared.